A gigantic mechanized harvester cuts through a field of super premium California rice. Fleets of these machines work similar fields across 500,000 acres of the northern Sacramento Valley. More than 4 billion pounds are harvested, trucked, dried, and stored in enormous warehouses and silos. Strategically dispensed to high-tech milling facilities, it is milled, packaged, and shipped to consumers all over the world. This is the heart of California's rice industry that employs 25,000 people and generates $5 billion each year. And all of it made possible by more than 100 years of intense environmental engineering to transform the natural wetlands that once were here into a rice factory. But unlike most agribusinesses in California's Central Valley, driven solely for the commodities they produce, this region is different. Within and all around the many rice fields and orchards is habitat for 200+ wildlife species, food for 7 to 10 million birds that migrate along the Pacific Flyway, and the most successful salmon recovery anywhere. These are the fruits of a determined effort to change the legacy of environmental exploitation and habitat loss so familiar in California, and to reconcile the demands of modern civilization with the needs of nature.
Seeing what the rice industry has been able to do in this part of our, little piece of the world has been something that I think has started to change people's thinking.
We're doing so much more than farming rice. We're farming for the birds and we're farming for fish.
It became an amazing opportunity to have a relationship with the environment in a very productive way.
And running through it all is a modest ribbon of water called Butte Creek. The novel partnerships that first surfaced here and the environmental successes that flowed from them are now models for conservation efforts all across the northern Sacramento Valley and beyond. It is late fall, and the harvest is long over. Farmers all across the northern Sacramento Valley are again diverting water to their fields, but not for growing crops. This flow is for nature. The water flooding this field, and hundreds of thousands of acres like it, is the opposite of typical farming practice. Instead of hurrying the water off the land and draining it, drying it out, in preparation for cultivation next spring, this water will sit calf-deep all winter long, creating vast stretches of wetland habitat and spinning rice straw into food. These flooded fields represent a sea change, a radical departure from the environmental history of this region that began even before California became a state.
Butte Creek was the last stream to the north that had gold. The miners came in and pretty much disrupted everything, initially starting out with small-scale mining, then eventually building dams and diverting water. And then eventually a whole new type of mining equipment was developed, the dredgers. And Butte Creek was a perfect place to literally come in, dig a hole, build a dredge, fill it up with water, and start clawing through the floodplain. and dozens of these large dredgers, completely turned the floodplain upside down.
The economy of California began to shift in the latter part of the 19th century from mining to agriculture. Along Butte Creek, European immigrants found rich soils, a sunny climate, and plenty of water.
The first settlers that came here, they thought they were going to grow corn and wheat. They thought they could grow trees. And they got here and they found out this soil is clay. And when it rains, the soil is like glue. And when it's dry in the summer, the soil without water is like rocks. They couldn't grow wheat. They couldn't grow corn. They couldn't grow trees on this soil. This soil is rice soil.
Butte County capitalized on its natural gifts to become the heart of California's rice industry. But the conditions, so favorable in most years, could also swing between brutal extremes, devastating floods and cruel droughts. As farms and cities grew, so did the demand for flood control, reliable water supplies, and power.
The Sabla Centerville hydroelectric project started in the early 1900s. 2 dams were built, both divert water out of the creek and down the flumes and through the powerhouses.
Together with growing agricultural interests, more dams were built on Butte Creek along with an ever-tightening grid of levees. The reclamation projects divorced the rivers from the surrounding floodplain. They destroyed natural wetland habitat and blocked wildlife migration. What was happening on Butte Creek was happening all over California. By the mid-20th century, every single river on the east side of the valley had been dammed. Thousands of miles of levees built, and all but a tiny fraction of the state's wetlands were gone. Not only did rice production destroy natural habitat, it polluted the air. To rid their fields of rice straw, growers would set their fields ablaze. 500,000 burning acres sent a pall of smoke over the valley for weeks on end. The Rice Straw Burning Reduction Act, passed in 1991, threatened to devastate the rice industry.
And so to figure out new ways of getting rid of that straw, and one of the great win-wins for conservation and for farming was the idea that we could flood these fields, allowing the straw to decompose over the winter, but at the same time creating tremendous wetland habitat for millions of water birds.
Initially, it was done with the idea that we need to decompose the rice straw. But birds came. Amazing amount of birds came to use the rice fields that were flooded for habitat and to eat the rice that was left.
But even as birds began to rebound, native fish populations were collapsing.
Right about the time the state water project started operating, things really crashed.
In between the early 60s and the mid 90s, the returning fish were really low, like in the hundreds of fish returning.
So that was kind of a wake up to people that hated.
Paul Ward worked for the Department of Fish and Game in the 1970s. His job was to monitor fish passage on Butte Creek.
In general, there was inadequate flow during key times of the year, both for adults and juveniles. There were no fish screens, and during key times of the year, the water was cut off. And so the fish passage, both adult and juvenile, was terrible. It was only in a very unusual year that you either got all the adults up or the juveniles out. The other thing was that the upper watershed, the prime holding habitat, the water was being diverted out of that. The last 6 or 8 miles, PG&E was diverting water out to produce power. So the temperatures during the summer when these adults would have been here was lethal.
Over the years, the fish never improved. We anticipated an eventual listing of the spring run Chinook under the Endangered Species Act.
Endangered fish listing, that was certainly a big threat. All of a sudden, there was a whole lot of other people that were concerned about what effect it might have on their business, on their land, on their use of the water. So that got everybody talking.
The threat was so dire, the problem so complex, it forced a revolution in thought and practice. Collaboration.
You can't do a project like Butte Creek any way other than collaboration. You can't regulate it, that's for sure. It's too complex. You need too many people cooperating.
You had the farmers partnering up with urban water agencies from LA. We also partnered with state and federal governments, the people that typically regulate irrigated agriculture. And this was truly unprecedented because partnerships like that didn't exist back then.
When people come together and say, we all want the same thing, can't we just find out what we have in common and work together? All of a sudden, new lights start to come on, new partnerships start to be formed, and all of a sudden, cooperation breeds success, and success breeds success.
Their main assault hammered at the dams. Led by Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt, they demolished 4 dams, opening up 25 miles of Butte Creek to unimpeded flow. The Western Canal Water District, the largest irrigator in the region, replaced its dams with an ingenious device.
We decided to tunnel underneath Butte Creek. What that tunnel is technically called is an inverted siphon, but it's basically a tunnel.
The remaining dams on Butte Creek were retrofitted with fish ladders and screens. Flows were increased and monitored to meet new threshold levels. No longer would adults be blocked from spawning grounds or juveniles flushed out to irrigation canals.
That whole process, particularly from Highway 99 below Chico down to the Sutter Buttes, was fixed in a matter of 7 or 8 years. Then the process moved down into the Butte Sink and the Sutter Bypass, and that is still ongoing down there.
The response was immediate.
The first year after our project, we had 20,000 fish return in the spring. Now, there's a sustaining population of 6,000 to 8,000 fish returning on average each year. And that's just a phenomenal recovery.
A team from California Department of Fish and Wildlife is suiting up to survey the year's population.
And they are looking at the condition of the fish. If we find any dead carcasses, they'll take biological samples, but essentially it's just monitoring the condition and health of the fish over the summertime. Everybody's been through some swiftwater rescue training. It can be pretty treacherous. I mean, the terrain is uneven, high flows. The adults that returned have great conditions, so they're just hanging out all summer long in cool pools and waiting for fall time temperatures to cool down, and they'll spawn the last week of September to about the end of October.
Of the 3 waterways in California that still support spring run Chinook salmon, Butte Creek is by far the most prolific. The average return of about 8,000 or so represents nearly 90% of the entire state's population. Butte Creek has become the poster child for salmon recovery in the state. But this is not the end of the story. In some ways, it's just the beginning.
There was a bunch of great work that happened on Butte Creek, but it's work that's been done in a lot of places. What was really unique and surprising about Butte Creek was when that work was done, when ladders were put to get fish over diversions, when dams were taken out. The fish population responded so dramatically and so quickly. And in hindsight, we saw that there was another aspect present in Butte Creek that wasn't present in other places, and that was that Butte Creek was still connected, was still consistently every year connected to its floodplains. That the water of Butte Creek would spill out over its natural levees and out onto a floodplain and then move back in, but not just of its natural levees. The system was managed in duck clubs, in refuges, both state and federal, for waterfowl, to interact with the landscape in a way that the rest of the Sacramento River and its tributaries just doesn't do anymore.
That connection, that interaction, led fish biologists from the University of California at Davis to look beyond the creek itself its fish ladders and screens, and out onto the floodplain. There they found another key to salmon recovery: food. Lots of food.
The floodplains are good for juvenile fish because they're basically food factories. And when the water spreads out, the food grows, the fish eat the food, and that's when the fish are growing big. In the river, there's just really not a lot of food, and there never was historically, and that's the reason why the floodplains are beneficial. We sample the water to understand what type of food will grow there.
Temperature, pH, chlorophyll, and many other variables are measured and recorded across the watershed throughout the winter and spring. It's all part of finding the best recipe for what these field researchers call zoop soup.
This thing is chock full of zooplankton. It's so full, it won't even drain out of there.
There's so many zooplankton, which are little microscopic bugs, but those are what the fish are eating.
Wow, a lot of fish food there.
And we like to call it the zoop soup.
Come on, fish. Here, fishy, fishy, fish. Yeah. You go and get in the net now.
We go out and seine fish in the natural environment to see how fish use it.
Oh, this thing's filthy with salmon right now.
Yeah, well, it's a fat one too.
Yeah, that's a spring run size one. Each fish gets its weight taken, and we look at the condition of the fish and look at the body proportions.
What those measurements show is salmon from the flooded rice fields and wetlands within the Butte Creek watershed grow on average 3 times bigger and fatter than their peers confined to the rivers.
Oh, hey, look at that!
Their robust size and high condition, so extraordinary in the Butte Creek watershed, inspired a question of paradigm-shifting proportion. Could the rice fields all around be managed to mimic Butte Creek's connected floodplain? In other words, could Butte Creek be the model for recovery efforts all across the northern Sacramento Valley?
First fish is D9 3B.
Researchers from California Trout are working to answer that question. Juvenile salmon are being prepped for their stay in a field laboratory cut into the corner of a rice farm. This research project is all about finding just the right amount of residence time, the time it takes for a reactivated floodplain to grow food and ultimately fish.
What we're really talking about is the power of puddles to create life, to move this. You might think this is just a piece of grass, it's rice straw, right? That's a battery. This is stored solar energy, and we want to get that energy not just into the water, but into salmon. We want to be able to manage the landscape in such a way that we can route energy and matter into the populations where it really matters, that we're targeting, that are now endangered. And we think we can do that fairly simply by reactivating this former wetland floodplain.
Giving fish access to the reactivated floodplain is another key goal. Researchers propose modifying some of the state's existing flood control structures, like the Tisdale Weir.
So Tisdale Weir and all of the weirs in the system, the connections between the river and the floodplain, look like this most of the time. They're dry, right? The floodplain is dry most of the time, and that's because these weirs are so high. The water is too low on the other side of this. It doesn't come through this weir. It acts as a dam most of the time. But if you were to cut a gate right here so that it could open when you wanted it and close when you didn't, that would mean that water and fish could access the floodplain at the times when it really makes sense, meaning that we could get big water benefits in normal and dry years.
Despite the certain benefit, the hard truth is most of these rice fields won't be reconnected to the river anytime soon, and most fish, now trapped in the rivers, will never get access to them. So, instead of bringing the fish to the food, researchers are now studying how to deliver the food to the fish, the fishery version of Grubhub or DoorDash.
This water sits out here for 3 weeks until it's literally seething with invertebrates. Then the field drains to the pumping plant, and the pumping plant pumps the water, now rich with all of this fish food, into the Sacramento River, where young fish are trapped in a food desert.
To document the effect, fish are placed in cages both upstream and downstream. A suite of data are collected. But most importantly, overall growth rates are measured and compared every week for a month and a half.
And what we find is that the fish that are right in the plume of that water, of that floodplain goodies coming out, those grow 4 or 5 times as fast as the fish just upstream that don't have access to it.
And the fish food buffet doesn't just stay there. It caters to hungry fish far downriver. Caged test fish, 6 miles downstream, still grew up to 3 times faster than their counterparts just above the outfall. All strong evidence that much of the existing agriculture system can be managed not only to grow fish food, but deliver it back into the river where fish can feast on it.
And what we're showing here is that if you manage the landscape with a knowledge of nature, with a knowledge of the patterns of how this place, the Sacramento Valley, worked before human settlement, before European settlement, and integrate that into the way that we manage our water, that we farm our fields, we can have a system that works so much better for both people and for the environment. What we're talking about is not going back. We're not talking about allowing the Sacramento Valley to flood for months at a time in a haphazard fashion. It isn't an interruption to how business is done out here. It's an augmentation, it's an enhancement. It's saying, yes, in the summer we're going to make food and money for people. These same grounds in fall and winter and early spring can reactivate, can re-energize our river ecosystems. That also translates to reactivating California's economy. Because in a functioning river ecosystem that can actually produce robust, healthy populations of fish and wildlife is a system that is much better able to deliver water security to both our farms and our cities.
It is early spring. Farmers all across this watershed begin the careful diversion of Butte Creek water onto their waiting fields. These flows signal the start of another production year. As waterways go in California, Butte Creek is modest, a mere 100 miles long. But Butte Creek carries an outsized story. From its headwaters, through the middle reaches, and out across the floodplain, water users have learned to manage this watershed as an interconnected whole for the benefit of both humans and nature. Many believe Butte Creek is the very definition of reconciliation ecology's promise of win-win.
In my mind, the environment won, the farmers won, downstream water users win. So when we can come up with partnered solutions to complex ecosystem problems and still be able to maintain what we're doing, that is the definition of win-win.
You probably could just add a lot more wins on that. Win, 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 win. I don't know if it's 2, 3, 4, 5 wins.
It's a win for the local farmers, huge win for the environment, and it was a win for the state as a whole in showing a different, better way to go about ecosystem restoration than what we've been trying unsuccessfully for decades.
I think this is such a perfect example of how we can all use the land for multiple benefit. For people, for farms, for birds, for fish. We are an example of how a resource can continue to work for different species, and people included.
I hope that this will be the success story 100 years from now, that we really can look back at and say we were able to fix it. We were able to undo what we had done and put it back. Maybe not exactly as it was prior to the levees coming up, but enough that we were able to really make a difference like we did on Butte Creek and have that success story throughout the valley.
As the harvest winds down, farmers again prepare their fields for winter. Soon, the birds will return, so many they will darken the sky, and newly hatched salmon will make their way out onto the floodplain to grow fat before heading out to the ocean. These flooded fields are the wetlands of yore. And while their laser-leveled, gravity-irrigated precision grids may look different than the ancient floodplain, they function the same way. It is a modern version of the ancient cycle, a sharing of Butte Creek for the benefit of all the species that live here.